Well, I feel, don't everyone leave when I start talking. It's okay, Evan, I don't mind. I'll get you back. I feel the need to at least tell one joke because you've talked you've been listening for so long and so faithfully. So it's from the opening, the chapter that I wrote, and it connects very nicely with the ringing telephone at the start of our session today. For those people who did see Q&A last night, Barry Humphries was on, the legendary Barry Humphries was on, and his phone rang as he started talking, and he actually answered the phone and said, you know, I'll talk to you later. So I thought that Gay would at least have a go at doing that. But what it reminded me of was, of course, one of Barry Humphries' jokes, which is that Australia is the Brisbane of the world. This is a joke that I always tell in New Zealand to make sure that they know that I'm prepared to put myself in a one-down position when, in fact, most of the traffic in New Zealand is the other way. I won't go on with any more New Zealand jokes because they're totally irrelevant to today's proceedings. But let me say a few things just very briefly about Brisbane, because Gay's raised it and stolen all of my thunder, which is great because it means that I'll talk for half as long as I was going to, and I'm sure you're going to be very pleased about that. But the Brisbane, my chapter starts with Brisbane, and what we've got is a classic case study in Brisbane of the problematics of the creative class discourse, a la Richard Florida, because Brisbane has experienced unprecedented growth, the southeast Queensland corridor. Oh, you're back, Evan, that's wonderful.
I wouldn't miss this.
Unprecedented growth in southeast Queensland, Brisbane and its surrounding cities and country. Very high growth rates, second only to Phoenix at one stage in the 2000s. And what we see in the data is that has given rise to an increase in the creative class. There are more professionals in Brisbane. Between the 2001 and 2006 census data, there are very clear, very, very strong growth in the professional class, which of course Florida defines as part of the creative class in Brisbane. And a very significant decrease in working class. Demographics. Now, what I say here is that this hasn't changed some of the problematics of the relation between consumption and production, because the professional class has certainly given rise to a stronger consumption base in this city, to wit, such indicators as Goma beating the NGV as the most popular visitation site for a gallery in the country last year. So it's increased the consumption base, but the problematics of production and of the producer class, if you like, in Brisbane and southeast Queensland haven't changed very dramatically. Yes, there's been some slight shifts in those people who actually who do deals, create projects, create wealth, create opportunity, the producer class, defined broadly, but it still remains significantly different from Sydney and Melbourne. And as Gay has said, I don't think it actually equates to being a totally uncreative city. What it does do is to try to get underneath the hood, underneath the bonnet of this usual kind of idea. Has Brisbane grown up? Is it, you know, more cosmopolitan? Is it more creative? Well, in terms of Florida's terms, it would be a good news story. In terms of the problematics of wealth creation and opportunity creation, not such a good story. The brain drain is there is still a net brain drain of cultural leadership out of this region. And so I try to talk about that as a way into what I think is the structuring tension in creative cities discourses, and that is the tension between production and consumption. And you can see it, you don't have to look very far, when you look at the amount of criticism that's been directed at Florida, Richard Florida. Florida's basically got a consumption-driven account of creative cities. He's interested in what the creative class do at leisure, not at what they do at work. And and all the major production-centric leaders in this discourse have certainly lined up to attack Florida. And I, for one, am someone who probably leans on the production side rather than the consumption side, because I think that's where real cultural leadership occurs over time, and it's how to grow that class, if you like, that group that can create opportunity and create wealth and do the deals and put the teams together, that has led us here, for instance, to put a lot of stress on producer training in this faculty. And Michael, you'll know the background to all of that in terms of the work that we've tried to construct with you. So that's a really has directly come out of the kind of research into what's really happening underneath the bonnet, underneath the hood of the cliches that Barry Humphries and others love to talk about Brisbane. So what I'm trying to say about Creative Cities discourse is very much around the tensions between production and consumption. I won't go into the details of that, because I know you'll rush out and buy the book immediately on the end of this session. But it connects with work that's been going on elsewhere in the faculty, and in fact it came up in last week's seminar. And Marcus, are you still here? Well, Marcus Ford had some interesting remarks to make about this production-consumption tension, and basically said, isn't that a little bit old world? Aren't some of the most interesting aspects of cultural activity, isn't that a blurring of production and consumption? And of course that gets us into the whole areas of digital content, of social media, of producage, a term that Axel Bruns has made famous around the world. The whole question of how culture may be changing in terms of that blurring of production-consumption distinctions. So I trace that through a little bit, and I try to kind of say, apart from raising questions, as Gay's mentioned, raise some questions around some of the limitations of the Creative Cities discourse. But I hone in on this question of how do we get policies that stimulate production and consumption, that also blur that distinction, that support work that is produce-age-like, rather than either the edifice complexes that we know so well, that politicians and policymakers love to get involved with. That is, build a great big building, you've got a great monument to your contribution, which will last forever, and maybe you'll even get a plaque on it. The edifice complex tends to lock up limited budgets. It tends to focus attention on, we will build it and hope they will come. It's going on in the Gold Coast right now, a great big effort, build up to the Commonwealth Games in 2018 to renovate and make a huge investment around a piece of real estate. And it is a way of focusing policy. It's a way of focusing budgets and efforts. There's no question about that. But I enter some fairly, I think, strong and compelling demurrers about a focus only on those kinds of questions of the edifice complex. So the question of what kind of policies would stimulate both production and consumption, that's what my chapter ends with. And since then I've gone on to do some further work on this, stimulated very much by a piece of work that colleagues in the Centre of Excellence have done called the Creative Cities Index. Not another one, surely. Before they did their work, they counted 16 Creative Cities indexes that exist in the world today. So what possibly could they add to it? What they added to it was precisely the impact of produceage, the impact of digital content creation, the ways in which social media are changing the nature of tourism patterns, the amount of tagging of a city as an indicator of its value in the social media world, the economics of attention and of micro-productivity, rather than of all the old, let's count the number of art galleries, let's count the number of visitors. And they've shown in this piece of work that they compared 6 cities, Berlin, Brisbane, London, I can't remember all of them, and what they came up with as a preliminary finding was that the very large cities, the cities that are global, have even greater advantages or even greater intensity at this level of micro-productivity, this level of the economics of attention than previously. Now, that's not necessarily a great result for a place like Brisbane, but it does emphasise the importance of, if you're interested in city branding, if you're interested in policies around city branding, you've got to be in social media if you want any real like contemporary sets of profiles to exist. So I talk a bit. I go into that in a little bit in a later version of this piece of work, and I point to some work that's been going on around the economic value of social media, work that's now emerging that puts a contribution to GDP of social media use in particular countries. For instance, Deloitte has estimated that there is a £2 billion contribution directly to the UK economy from the use of Facebook. So questions of producage of social media and of digital content in these well-established and rather tired fields of what constitutes creative cities. There's some new information to throw in. And I want to conclude just talking a little about my contribution to the book by saying cultural policy isn't dead. There's some very, very active work going on at the national cultural policy level in this country. Simon Crean is conducting a very significant review of national cultural policy and hopes to be able to launch it later this year. It's already produced a pretty radical, and Brad, who's a member of the board, will certainly be well aware of this, a pretty radical review of the Australia Council that is proposing some pretty significant and pretty contemporary insights into change that might occur in the major funding body. So, it's a pretty hot area. It's a pretty hot area of policy today, and I've been very impressed being a member of the National Cultural Policy Reference Group of the way in which the Minister has gone about trying to put forward new ideas and secure consensus around new ideas around national cultural policy. And I won't, anyone who follows this, and I imagine you all do, would be aware of what he's been saying publicly. And I think there's great, at least rhetorical and aspirational development that might occur around the national cultural policy scene in the latter half of this year. So that's enough for me, but I do want to say before I hand back to Alan to wrap up that it's been a great honour and pleasure to have Raj here today. It's been wonderful to, Alan mentioned that Marion Sims has come from Canberra, from the ARC to be with us today, and I thank her very much for that effort. And Mark Banks, who hasn't had a mention, Mark is a visitor with us this week, a strong colleague of Justin's, and he'll be giving a public talk on Thursday, which I hope you all know about. So thank you to our visitors today, and thank you for being here. It's been a great partnership over the since certainly the volume 2 of the series. With Raj, we've played a small role in the hopefully the success of the series, and and we thank you for including us in what has been an amazing set of reference, authoritative reference works in contemporary cultural thinking and towards cultural policy. So thank you, Raj, and now I will hand back to Alan to take over it with Q&A.